On a cold October evening in 2004, a 16-year-old girl left track practice, cut through a familiar park on her walk home, and never arrived. Police searched the park. They searched the woods beyond it. They searched the creek, the storm drains, every house along her route, every car registered within 5 miles of the school. They found nothing. No witnesses, no struggle, no evidence she had ever entered those woods at all. The case went cold within a year, cold within 5. By the time she would have turned 30, most people in Ashland Falls, Oregon, assumed she was dead. One more name on a list of teenagers who simply never come home. 19 years later, a routine digital forensics review of an unrelated case on the other side of the country uncovered an old messaging account no one had ever known existed. And what investigators found inside it rewrote everything they thought they understood about the last day of her old life. What investigators uncovered next shocked everyone. Before we continue, if you enjoy mysteries, cold cases, and shocking investigations, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another mystery. Ashland Falls was a town built around its high school, the way some towns are built around a church or a courthouse. Friday nights belonged to football games, and every storefront on Main Street had, at one point or another, hung a hand-painted banner congratulating some team or another on a district title. It was the kind of place where a 16-year-old could walk 2 miles home through a park after dark, and no parent thought twice about it, because nothing had ever happened there worth thinking twice about. Madison Maddie Turner was a junior that fall, a distance runner with a personal best mile time that had already caught the attention of 2 college scouts, though she'd confided to her best friend, Priya Anand, that she wasn't sure running was really what she wanted to build a life around. What she actually wanted, she said, half embarrassed to admit it out loud, was to study marine biology. She'd fallen in love with the ocean during a single-family vacation to the Oregon coast at age 11 and never quite recovered, filling a corkboard above her desk with printouts about tide pools and bioluminescent plankton that her mother teased her about lovingly for years. She lived with her parents, Robert and Diane Turner, and her older brother Jake, 20, home from his first semester of college that October and still adjusting, awkwardly, to being treated like a guest in the house he'd grown up in. Robert managed the town's only hardware store. Diane worked as a dental hygienist 3 days a week and spent the other 2 volunteering at the public library, where she'd instilled in both her children a habit of reading that Maddie carried everywhere, including, most days, in the pocket of her track bag. Maddie's friends remembered her as fiercely loyal, quick with a joke at her own expense, the kind of girl who organized a surprise birthday scavenger hunt for Priya that spring involving 9 separate locations across town, each with its own clue written in Maddie's looping handwriting. She had, that same October, just started dating a boy from her chemistry class named Tyler Brandt, a relationship still new enough that she hadn't told her parents the full extent of it, though Priya knew everything, the way best friends always seem to. Her track coach, Denise Falk, remembered her as the kind of runner who never needed to be pushed, who showed up to every optional Saturday practice without fail, chasing a state qualifying time she was, by every measure Coach Falk could see, genuinely close to reaching. By every account from every person who knew her, October of 2004 was shaping up to be one of the best years of Maddie Turner's young life. The Turner house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac 3 blocks from Larkspur Park, a modest split level with a basketball hoop over the garage that had belonged to Jake first and had, over the years, become Maddie's, the 2 siblings trading the driveway back and forth through a decade of one-on-one games that Jake almost always won, and Maddie rarely let him forget he'd had to work for. Diane Turner kept a garden along the side fence that produced, every August, more tomatoes than the family could eat, and Maddie had spent that particular September going door to door with grocery bags of them, more out of a stubborn refusal to let anything go to waste than any real neighborliness, though the neighbors appreciated it either way. Robert Turner had taught Maddie to run the way his own father had taught him, not through any formal coaching, but through early Saturday mornings along the river trail when she was 10, jogging slow enough that she could keep pace beside him while he told her, mile after mile, stories about his own childhood in a town 2 states over that had long since stopped existing in any form she could visit. By the time she reached high school, she had long since outpaced him, but she still asked him, most Saturdays that fall, to come along anyway, content to run ahead and then loop back to keep him company rather than leave him behind entirely. Her bedroom told the story of a girl caught between two versions of herself: track ribbons pinned in a neat row along one wall, and, covering nearly every other surface, printouts and library books about coral reefs and deep-sea bioluminescence, borrowed so often from the town library that Diane eventually joked her daughter should just be given her own permanent shelf. A single postcard from that childhood trip to the Oregon coast, curling slightly at the corners, was taped above her desk lamp, a photograph of tide pools at low tide that she'd stared at. Her mother later said, the way other teenagers stared at posters of pop stars. Ashland Falls High School sat at the edge of town, close enough to the surrounding hills that on clear afternoons the cross-country and track teams could see the tree line turning color from the practice field. Maddie ran the same loop through those hills nearly every day after school, a habit that had, over 3 years, worn a faint path through the grass that other runners eventually started following simply because it was hers first. Her bedroom, at the end of the upstairs hallway in the Turners' modest craftsman-style house, faced east, and she'd told her mother once, half joking, that she liked waking up to the sunrise because it made her feel like she was already halfway through her morning run before her feet ever hit the floor. She kept a running log in a spiral notebook, tracking not just her times, but the weather, her mood, small details she thought might matter later. A habit Coach Falk had recommended to the whole team, but that only Maddie, characteristically, actually stuck with for more than a few weeks. The notebook, recovered by police during the original search of her room, would become, over 19 years, one of the only physical traces of the last ordinary weeks of her old life, a document Diane Turner read and reread so many times that the spine eventually gave out entirely. That same October, Maddie had submitted an application to a marine biology summer program at a coastal university, the kind of application that required a personal essay she'd rewritten 4 separate times, agonizing over every sentence, determined to sound passionate without sounding, in her own self-conscious teenage assessment, like a nerd who'd never actually seen the ocean up close. She had, in fact, seen the ocean exactly once on that single childhood vacation, and had spent every year since trying to find a reason to go back. Diane Turner had helped her fill out the financial aid section of that application on the kitchen table one evening that September. The two of them hunched over a laptop that belonged, technically, to Robert's hardware store, but had migrated permanently into family use once Jake left for college, and Diane would later describe that evening. An entirely unremarkable hour of paperwork and quiet complaining about acceptance essay word limits, as one of the memories she returned to most often in the years that followed, precisely because nothing about it felt significant at the time. Tyler Brandt had given Maddie a small, cheap keychain shaped like a sea turtle 2 weeks before she disappeared, a joke gift from a school fundraiser table that had somehow become, without either of them quite deciding it should, something she carried on her track bag every single day afterward. Investigators recovered the keychain, still clipped to the strap, when they searched the tree line near the school parking lot in the first days of the case. One of the only physical items connected to Maddie ever found, a detail that offered no answers but that the Turner family kept, afterward, in a small memory box alongside her running log. October 22nd, 2004, was a Friday, cold and overcast, the first real bite of autumn settling over Ashland Falls after an unusually warm September. Track practice ran until 5:15 that afternoon, an hour later than usual because Coach Falk had scheduled extra intervals ahead of the following weekend's regional meet. Maddie left the school on foot at 5:22, according to 2 teammates who watched her walk toward the tree line at the edge of the parking lot, waving goodbye and calling out that she'd see them Monday. Her usual route home cut through Larkspur Park, a wooded green space bisecting the 2 neighborhoods, shaving nearly 15 minutes off the walk compared to the sidewalk route along the main road. A shortcut she'd taken hundreds of times without incident since she was old enough to be allowed to walk home alone. She was expected home by 5:45. By 6, with dinner on the table and Maddie's phone. A rare luxury for a 16-year-old in 2004, one her parents had bought specifically so she could check in on her walks home. Going straight to voicemail, Diane Turner felt the first cold pull of unease she would later describe as instantly, viscerally different from ordinary worry. Robert Turner drove the length of Larkspur Park twice before calling Coach Falk, who confirmed Maddie had left practice on time and seemed, in every way, entirely herself. He called Tyler Brandt next, whose mother answered and put her son on the phone, sounding confused. He hadn't seen Maddie since sixth period, he said, his voice cracking slightly with a fear that would only grow over the following hours. By 7:30, Robert and Diane Turner were walking through Larkspur Park themselves with flashlights, calling their daughter's name into a darkness that gave nothing back except the sound of wind moving through bare branches. By 8:15, they had called the police. By midnight, Ashland Falls police had a search underway across the park and the surrounding blocks, and Maddie Turner, last seen walking into the tree line in her burgundy track jacket, backpack slung over one shoulder, had vanished as completely as if the October evening had folded shut behind her. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s by the time the first search teams fanned out through Larkspur Park with flashlights, their beams catching against a fine mist that had settled over the creek, turning the whole park into something that looked, to more than one volunteer that night, unsettlingly unfamiliar despite having walked through it 100 times before. The footbridge, in particular, drew searchers back to it again and again throughout the night, though no one could quite articulate why beyond a shared, wordless sense that something about that stretch of the park felt wrong. Diane Turner spent those first hours making the same phone call over and over to Maddie's teammates, to her few close friends, to the parents of boys she'd never dated but might, conceivably, have wandered off to see. Each call ending the same way, with a voice on the other end growing quieter and more frightened as the pattern of no one having seen her daughter became undeniable. She would later describe the specific, physical sensation of dialing a phone number for the fourth or fifth time and having her hands shake too badly to get the digits right on the first try. Robert Turner walked the length of the creek on foot twice before officers arrived, calling his daughter's name into water black with the reflection of a moonless sky, convinced, in the particular magical thinking that grips a parent in those first desperate hours, that if he simply walked far enough and called loud enough, she would somehow answer. But investigators would soon discover that wasn't even the strangest part. The Ashland Falls Police Department, a department of 14 officers accustomed to little more than the occasional bar fight and seasonal vandalism, found itself managing the largest search operation in the town's history within 24 hours. County sheriff's deputies, state police, and eventually an FBI liaison joined the effort as the case moved, with unsettling speed, from a possible runaway to a suspected abduction. Search dogs picked up Maddie's scent at the edge of the school parking lot and followed it cleanly through the first third of Larkspur Park, along the exact path her friends described her taking, and then lost it entirely near a small wooden footbridge crossing the creek that ran through the park's center, a spot barely 400 yards from where dozens of joggers, dog walkers, and commuters passed by every single day. No scent trail continued on either side of the creek. It was as though she had stepped onto that bridge and simply ceased to exist. Investigators interviewed more than 80 people in the first 2 weeks alone. Classmates, teachers, neighbors, everyone who had been in or near the park that Friday evening. Contradictions piled up quickly, the way they always do in a town suddenly forced to reconstruct an ordinary afternoon under a magnifying glass. 2 different joggers reported seeing a parked car near the park's northern entrance sometime between 5:15 and 5:45, though their descriptions of the make and color didn't match. A woman walking her dog recalled hearing what she thought was laughter near the footbridge around 5:30, followed, she said, by a sound she couldn't place at the time and had spent 19 years since trying not to think too hard about. Tyler Brandt, the boyfriend, became an early focus. His shaky, tearful interview on the night of the disappearance read by some investigators as grief and by others as something closer to guilt. He had no solid alibi for the exact window Maddie vanished, having left campus separately after a brief chemistry tutoring session that ran later than usual. Investigators searched his family's car, his bedroom, and his school locker, finding nothing, and eventually cleared him after cell tower data. Knew enough at the time to be treated almost like a novelty by the department, placed his phone consistently near his own house throughout the relevant window. A groundskeeper who maintained Larkspur Park part-time drew scrutiny after a coworker mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd once been let go from a summer camp job years earlier, under circumstances no one could quite remember. The rumor spread through town faster than any actual evidence did, and though he was formally cleared within days, his timesheet placing him at a hardware store 40 minutes away buying mower parts at the exact time Maddie disappeared. His life in Ashland Falls never fully recovered from the suspicion. Even Coach Falk endured a round of quiet, uncomfortable questioning after a parent, motivated by an unrelated grudge over playing time on the team, suggested anonymously that the coach's closeness with her runners had always struck her as excessive. The claim dissolved on contact with the facts, but not before it cost Coach Falk 2 sleepless weeks and, in her own words, years later, a piece of the joy she'd once taken in coaching that she never fully got back. Detective Wayne Colson, the lead investigator, would later describe the file that accumulated that first winter as the strangest of his career. Dozens of half-leads, none of which connected to any of the others, circling a single 400-yard stretch of park that seemed to have simply swallowed a girl whole. Search dogs were brought back a second time in November, working both banks of the creek for nearly a full day in case the scent trail had simply been disrupted by the mist and rain of the first search night. They alerted faintly near a culvert half a mile downstream, a lead that consumed the department's resources for nearly 2 weeks before divers confirmed the culvert led nowhere but a storm drain too narrow for a body to have passed through. The FBI, consulted within the first month, produced a preliminary profile suggesting the disappearance carried hallmarks of either a targeted abduction by someone with prior knowledge of Maddie's routine, or, less likely given the complete absence of any struggle, a case in which the victim had left willingly with someone she trusted. The second possibility, floated cautiously by profilers and received with outright anger by the Turner family when it eventually leaked to a local reporter, haunted the investigation for years, an implication that Maddie herself had somehow chosen to go, one that Diane Turner would spend 19 years quietly, furiously rejecting even as a piece of her in her most exhausted moments, wondered if it might somehow be a kinder explanation than the alternative. A composite sketch, built from the 2 joggers' partial descriptions of the unfamiliar parked car near the park's northern entrance, was circulated across 3 counties, generating over 100 tips within the first 6 weeks. A rideshare-style informal carpool service one neighbor ran out of his garage was investigated for nearly a month after an anonymous caller suggested, without basis, that he sometimes gave rides to teenagers after school. He was cleared entirely once his handwritten log of pickups for that week, kept meticulously out of habit rather than necessity, accounted for every hour of his afternoon. A man staying at a motel on the edge of town that same week, initially flagged simply for being a stranger in a place where strangers were rare enough to be noticed, was held for questioning for nearly 2 days before his employer confirmed he'd been on site at a construction job 40 miles away for the entire relevant window, an alibi that took investigators considerably longer to verify than anyone in the department was comfortable admitting afterward. Every lead, without exception, dissolved on contact with the facts, and Detective Colson would say, years later, that the hardest part of that first winter wasn't the absence of a suspect. It was the growing, unbearable sense that whoever had taken Maddie Turner had planned it far more carefully than anyone in Ashland Falls wanted to believe was possible. The department brought in a criminal psychologist from the state crime lab that winter to help make sense of a case that resisted every conventional framework they tried to apply to it. She noted, in a report that sat largely unread in the file for 19 years, an observation that would later prove devastatingly accurate, that the total absence of physical evidence, combined with the complete absence of any witness who saw Maddie in visible distress, suggested an abductor who had spent considerable time earning trust rather than exploiting a moment of vulnerability. At the time, without any digital trail to support it, the observation read as speculative, one more theory in a file already crowded with theories that led nowhere. A local news station ran a 2-week series that December, asking viewers to re-examine their own memories of that Friday afternoon, generating a fresh wave of tips that investigators worked through with diminishing hope as the days grew shorter and the trail, already cold, grew colder still. A woman 2 towns over called in, certain she'd seen a girl matching Maddie's description at a gas station off the interstate that same evening, a lead that consumed nearly a week of resources before surveillance footage, recovered from the station's aging security system, showed conclusively that the girl in question was someone else entirely, a stranger passing through on an unrelated trip who was never even aware she'd become, briefly, the center of a missing child investigation 200 miles from her own home. The town changed in ways large and small in the years that followed. Larkspur Park's footbridge was fitted with a street lamp within 6 months, the first of several safety improvements the town council approved that winter, though most residents privately admitted the changes felt less like prevention and more like a way of doing something, anything, with a grief that otherwise had nowhere to go. Diane Turner kept Maddie's room untouched. The corkboard of ocean printouts still pinned above the desk, the burgundy track jacket she'd worn everywhere replaced in the closet by an identical one Diane bought the following spring, unable to explain to anyone, including herself, why it mattered so much that there be a second one waiting, just in case. Robert Turner sold the hardware store in 2009, unable to keep running a business that required him to make easy conversation with customers on days he could barely make himself get out of bed. He spent the better part of a decade organizing an annual search of Larkspur Park and the surrounding woods every October, a ritual that dwindled each year in the number of volunteers who showed up, but never once, in 19 years, went uncompleted. Jake Turner, Maddie's older brother, dropped out of college that winter and never went back, taking a job at a warehouse 2 towns over that let him stay close to his parents through a grief he watched slowly reshape both of them into people he sometimes struggled to recognize. He married in 2011 and named his first daughter Madison, a decision his wife supported without hesitation, understanding, even before she fully understood the family she was marrying into, that some names carry more weight than others. Priya Anand carried her own private theory for years, one she never fully voiced to police because it felt, she said, too flimsy to say out loud. That Maddie had mentioned, weeks before she disappeared, a new online friend she'd met through a fan forum for a marine biology documentary series, someone she talked to most evenings, someone Priya had never met and couldn't quite picture. Priya mentioned it once, briefly, in her original 2004 police interview. It was noted. It was never followed up on. In 2004, most departments simply didn't yet have the tools or the awareness to know what questions to ask about a friendship that existed entirely inside a computer screen. Coach Falk kept Maddie's name on the team roster for 2 full seasons after her disappearance, unable to bring herself to remove it, until a well-meaning assistant coach quietly did it for her during a summer roster update, an act of practicality that Coach Falk said, decades later, still felt to her like a small, unnecessary second loss layered on top of the first. The school retired Maddie's practice bib number the following spring, framing it alongside a photograph in the athletics hallway, a small memorial that generations of students who never knew her still passed every day on their way to class. The town's annual autumn festival, held every October since long before Maddie was born, was quietly moved up a week on the calendar starting in 2005, shifted just enough that its date no longer fell so close to the anniversary of her disappearance. A change the town council never formally explained, though everyone in Ashland Falls understood exactly why it had happened. Diane Turner became, over the years, an advocate almost by accident, testifying twice before the state legislature in favor of expanded funding for cold case DNA testing, sitting on advisory panels for missing persons organizations, doing the kind of institutional, unglamorous work that rarely makes headlines but slowly, cumulatively, changes how the next family's case gets handled. She said, in more than one of those testimonies, that she wasn't fighting for her daughter anymore by that point. She'd stopped believing, somewhere around year 12, that public advocacy alone would ever bring Maddie back. She was fighting, she said, for the next mother standing where she'd stood in 2004, so that the next department would know, from the very beginning, to ask the right questions about a friendship that existed only on a screen. Robert and Diane Turner's marriage survived the disappearance in a way that surprised even them, though not without cost. Years of a particular, exhausting silence that fell over the house every October, a grief they learned, eventually, to carry side by side rather than trying to fix in each other. They attended a support group for parents of missing children twice a month for over a decade, driving 40 minutes each way to a meeting in a church basement 2 counties over, sitting in a circle of folding chairs with other families whose stories, they came to understand, all carried the same terrible shape even when the details differed. The same sleepless nights, the same unbearable anniversaries, the same strange, guilty relief that came from being in a room where no one needed anything explained to them. Tyler Brandt, cleared of suspicion within the case's first weeks but never fully able to shake the shadow of having been an early focus, left Ashland Falls for college 2 years later and rarely returned, though he wrote Diane Turner a letter every October for the first several years, simply telling her he still thought about Maddie, still wondered, still hadn't forgotten. The letters stopped arriving sometime around 2011, and Diane never learned why, though she kept every one she'd received in the same memory box as the sea turtle keychain, unwilling to let even that small, incomplete thread go entirely. The groundskeeper, who had been wrongly suspected in the case's earliest days, eventually left Ashland Falls altogether, moving to a town where no one recognized his name from a 19-year-old newspaper article, a quiet, permanent casualty of a rumor that had never had any basis, in fact, but had followed him regardless, the way suspicion in a small town always seems to outlast the evidence that fails to support it. If you're enjoying this investigation so far, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps the channel continue bringing you stories like this. Now let's continue, because what investigators uncovered next was even more disturbing. For 19 years, Maddie Turner's case sat, mostly untouched, in the Ashland Falls Police Department's cold case files, revisited only for the occasional anniversary news segment and a handful of half-hearted tips that never led anywhere. In 2023, a cybercrime unit investigating an entirely unrelated case. An adult man in another state arrested on charges connected to a private online forum used to target teenagers. Began working through years of archived server data seized during the arrest, cross-referencing usernames and message logs against a national database of missing persons cases as a matter of routine procedure. One username, buried among thousands, triggered a flag, a private messaging handle that matched, almost exactly, a screen name Priya Anand had mentioned in her original 2004 interview. One investigators at the time had jotted down and never traced, because 2004 record-keeping for social platforms was inconsistent at best, and the platform itself, a small, now-defunct marine biology fan forum, had shut down and had its servers wiped years before anyone thought to ask. But a private third-party archive, run by a hobbyist who had backed up dozens of early 2000s internet forums before their servers disappeared, still held a partial record. Enough for the cybercrime unit to pull a thread of private messages exchanged between Marine Girl 16, an account investigators would soon confirm belonged to Maddie Turner, and a user going by Tidepool Tom in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The messages, read in full for the first time in 19 years, showed a pattern investigators recognized immediately and painfully. A stranger who had built trust slowly through shared enthusiasm for tide pools and ocean documentaries, gradually steering the conversation toward flattery, then toward secrecy, encouraging Maddie, gently and consistently, not to mention the friendship to her parents, framing the request not as a warning sign but as something private and special between them. The final message in the archived thread, sent the afternoon of October 22, 2004, arranged a meeting. Not at the footbridge, but nearby, at a spot along the creek Maddie would have had to leave her usual path to reach. One tiny overlooked clue, recovered from a server backup no one had known still existed, reopened everything. Detective Priya Chen. No relation to Priya Anand, a coincidence that struck both women deeply when they finally met. Had been assigned to Ashland Falls Cold Case Unit only the year before, and had grown up 2 counties overhearing her own mother's warnings about that girl who vanished from the park. Warnings that had shaped, without her ever fully realizing it until she opened the file herself, her decision to go into investigative work at all. Chen requested everything the cybercrime unit had recovered and spent the following weeks working alongside a digital forensics specialist to trace Tide Pool Tom back to a real identity, a process complicated by 19 years of platform changes, defunct email providers, and the deliberate anonymity the account had clearly been built to maintain from the very beginning. Before she ever pulled a single subpoena, Chen spent nearly a full week simply reading the entire original 2004 case file front to back, twice, the way she'd trained herself to do with every cold case she inherited, searching not just for what the file said, but for what it had never gotten around to asking. She found, in Priya Anand's original interview transcript, a single unfollowed sentence buried in the middle of 3 pages of routine questions and answers. Maddie had mentioned Priya told the original interviewing officer that her online friend knew a lot about currents and tide patterns for someone who said he'd never actually been diving, a detail the 2004 officer had noted without comment and never circled back to in an era when the very idea of a dangerous stranger existing entirely within a teenager's computer screen still felt, to most working detectives, like something out of a movie rather than a real investigative lead. That single overlooked sentence became, for Chen, the starting point of everything that followed. Not because it identified Voss directly, but because it told her, with total certainty, that the friendship Priya had mentioned in 2004 was real, specific, and worth chasing all the way down, no matter how many 19-year-old dead ends stood in the way. The account's original registration email, recovered from the archived server data, traced to a now-dormant free email provider popular in the early 2000s, subpoenaing the provider's remaining records. A company that had, remarkably, preserved decades-old account metadata as part of a broader data retention practice most users never knew existed, produced a recovery phone number linked to the account at the time of its creation. That number, cross-referenced against decades-old telecom billing records obtained through a painstaking series of court orders, traced to a prepaid phone purchased with cash at a drugstore in a town nearly 300 miles from Ashland Falls, 2 weeks before Maddie Turner disappeared. The purchase itself, captured on a grainy security camera the drugstore had, remarkably, migrated to a cloud storage archive years earlier as part of an unrelated corporate records policy, showed a man in a baseball cap paying in cash, his face angled carefully away from the camera in a way that struck the reviewing analyst as too consistent to be accidental. It would be months before investigators had a name to attach to that blurred, cap-shadowed face, but the image itself, once enhanced, became one of the case's most closely studied pieces of evidence. Proof, finally, that a real person, not a ghost, not an unsolvable mystery, had orchestrated every part of what happened to Maddie Turner. Chen's team cross-referenced the prepaid phone's limited call records against motel registries within driving distance of Ashland Falls for the weeks surrounding the purchase, a process that took weeks of subpoenas and dead-end paperwork before finally producing a single match. A motel 60 miles south of town where a guest had checked in under a name that would later prove to be an early, less polished alias than the Tide Pool Tom persona, paid in cash, and checked out the morning after Maddie Turner disappeared, never to be seen at that motel again. The suspect isn't who everyone believed. And this was only the first thread in a case that was about to unravel in directions no one in Ashland Falls could have anticipated. Financial and travel records connected to the prepaid phone's purchase led investigators to a man named Gerald Voss, 49 years old at the time of the renewed investigation, living under his own legal name in a small town in Idaho, working as a freelance web developer with no criminal record beyond a single decades-old citation for disorderly conduct that had never raised any red flags with anyone. Voss had, according to employment and property records reconstructed over the following weeks, spent much of the early 2000s working remote contract jobs that gave him wide, largely unsupervised freedom to travel. A detail that placed him, according to an expense report submitted to a former client and later subpoenaed, in the Pacific Northwest during the exact week Maddie Turner disappeared, ostensibly for an unrelated consulting job that, on closer inspection, appeared to have been invented entirely. Investigators built a chilling picture of a man who had spent years cultivating relationships with teenagers through niche online communities built around shared, wholesome interests. Marine biology forums, creative writing groups, fan communities for young adult book series. platforms chosen, a forensic psychologist consulting on the case explained, precisely because they attracted earnest, curious teenagers and carried none of the obvious warning signs parents in the early 2000s had been taught to watch for. Colleagues who had worked alongside Voss over the years, contacted during the widening investigation, described him consistently as unremarkable. Polite, competent, prone to long stretches of working alone and traveling for projects that rarely required the kind of client-facing detail his invoices suggested. A former landlord in Idaho recalled him as a quiet, tidy tenant who kept almost entirely to himself, the kind of neighbor most people could live beside for years without ever learning anything meaningful about. It was, investigators would come to understand, precisely the kind of surface ordinariness that had allowed him to move through nearly 2 decades of contract work, cross-country travel, and shifting addresses without a single institution ever having reason to look closer. A financial forensics review of Voss's decades of freelance income revealed a pattern of irregular, unexplained cash withdrawals clustered around specific dates that, once cross-referenced against the recovered journals, corresponded closely to periods investigators believe he was actively cultivating new online relationships. A rhythm of behavior that, examined in isolation, might have looked like nothing more than an eccentric contractor's inconsistent bookkeeping, but which, laid alongside everything else, formed a pattern too precise to be coincidence. A storage unit registered under Voss's name in a town outside Boise, seized under warrant, contained years of printed correspondence, photographs, and a series of handwritten journals investigators would spend months cataloging. Evidence, prosecutors would later argue, of a pattern that had not begun or ended with Maddie Turner, but had continued, in different forms, for the better part of 2 decades. Someone had lied for 19 years. Someone had built an entire life around a false, unremarkable name in an unremarkable town. And somewhere in that storage unit, buried among the journals, investigators found something that made the entire case explode into urgency all over again. But someone was still watching. The journals, cataloged and cross-referenced against known missing persons cases across 4 states, revealed references to at least 2 other teenagers besides Maddie Turner. 1. A boy from Nevada who had run away from a difficult home situation in 2011 and was never definitively linked to Voss beyond a handful of ambiguous references. The other, a girl from Washington State whose 2016 disappearance had been classified, for years, as a voluntary runaway case closed without ever being connected to anyone. The Nevada case involved a 17-year-old boy named Marcus Webb, whose family had long believed he'd run away following a bitter conflict at home. A conclusion investigators at the time had reached in part because a handful of messages recovered from his computer, sent from an account since deleted, seemed to describe plans to leave voluntarily. Re-examined in light of the Voss journals, those same messages now read to Chen's team, disturbingly differently. The same careful, escalating pattern of flattery and manufactured secrecy that had characterized the earliest messages to Maddie Turner over a decade earlier. Marcus Webb's mother, contacted for the first time in years, told investigators she had never fully believed her son ran away, that she'd simply had no other explanation anyone would take seriously at the time. The Washington case, involving a 15-year-old girl named Ava Reinhold, carried even less direct evidence connecting it to Voss. A single reference in one journal to a girl who loved the mountains the way Maddie loved the ocean, a phrase investigators found only after weeks of painstaking cross-referencing against every open case in the region that might plausibly fit. Ava's case remains formally unconnected as of this telling, though her family has been briefed on the possibility and has said, through a family spokesperson, that even an unconfirmed thread of hope is more than they've had in 8 years. Investigators began the painstaking work of determining whether either case could be reopened and connected conclusively, a process that remains ongoing and, as of this telling, has not yet produced definitive answers for either family. What the journals made unmistakably, chillingly clear, however, was that Gerald Voss had not stopped after Maddie Turner. He had simply gotten better at not being found. Everything the town of Ashland Falls had believed about that October evening in 2004 was wrong. It hadn't been a random abduction from a public park, the way most people had assumed for 19 years. It had been the culmination of weeks of careful, patient online grooming executed by a man who had never once set foot in Ashland Falls before the week he arranged to meet a 16-year-old girl he had spent months convincing to keep him secret. Reveal hidden relationships. Old questions answered. New, more urgent ones opening in their place. If Voss had taken Maddie Turner in 2004 and continued the same pattern for nearly 2 decades afterward, what, investigators now needed desperately to know, had actually happened to her? They had been looking at the wrong kind of suspect the entire time. Searching for someone from inside Maddie's world when the truth had been built patiently and invisibly from somewhere far outside it. Gerald Voss was arrested at his home in Idaho on unrelated charges connected to the cybercrime investigation that had first surfaced his name, 3 days before Detective Chen's team was prepared to formally connect him to Maddie Turner's disappearance. The timing, investigators later admitted, was equal parts fortunate and agonizing. Fortunate because it took him off the street before anyone could tip him off to the reopened Oregon case. Agonizing because it meant Chen spent those first 72 hours racing to secure evidence before any possibility existed that he might destroy what remained of it. The interrogation, conducted jointly by Idaho investigators and Detective Chen over the following week, produced little in the way of a full confession at first. Voss, represented by counsel almost immediately, answered most direct questions about Maddie Turner with careful, rehearsed denial. It was a single piece of physical evidence, ultimately, that broke the case open. A partial fingerprint recovered from the underside of the wooden footbridge railing in Larkspur Park, preserved for 19 years in a sealed evidence bag from the original 2004 investigation, that modern fingerprint analysis technology, far more sensitive than what existed in 2004, was finally able to match conclusively to Gerald Voss. Confronted with the match, Voss's story shifted, incrementally and reluctantly, over several additional days of questioning. He described meeting Maddie at the footbridge, not at the creek spot indicated in the archived messages, claiming she had suggested the change herself, a detail investigators could neither confirm nor disprove, given the incomplete state of the recovered message archive. He described her getting into his car voluntarily, believing, based on months of careful manipulation, that she was meeting a friend her own age rather than a man in his 30s. He would not say, for several more days, what happened after that. Prosecutors, aware that a full confession might never come, spent that same week building a parallel case from the physical and financial evidence alone, determined not to let the outcome hinge entirely on the cooperation of a man who had spent 19 years demonstrating, through every action, an extraordinary capacity for careful, patient deception. A forensic accountant traced the shell accounts Voss had used to fund the Montana facility's payments back through a chain of numbered accounts spanning 3 states, work that took weeks but ultimately produced a financial record almost as damning as a confession would have been. Detective Chen, present for most of the interrogation sessions, later described the strange, unsettling calm Voss maintained throughout most of the questioning. Not the panic or bravado she'd expected from a man finally confronted with 19 years of hidden crimes, but something closer to a kind of practiced patience, as though he had, on some level, always known this conversation might eventually happen and had simply waited it out, the same way he had waited out 19 years of searches, news segments, and anniversary vigils he must have known, at least distantly, were still happening in a town he'd never returned to. It wasn't over. Massive revelation followed massive revelation over the following weeks, each one forcing Ashland Falls to reckon with a truth far more disturbing than the town had spent 19 years bracing itself for. Voss eventually admitted, through his attorney, to keeping Maddie Turner captive for a period he described only as some time, before moving her, transporting her out of Oregon within the first 48 hours using a second vehicle he'd pre-positioned near the Idaho border specifically for that purpose. A detail that explained, at last, why the search dog's trail had ended so abruptly at the footbridge, and why no trace of her had ever surfaced anywhere near Ashland Falls in 19 years of searching. He would not, even after weeks of negotiation with prosecutors, confirm whether Maddie Turner was alive. Old crimes connected in ways that widened the investigation far beyond Oregon. Records recovered from the storage unit linked Voss to a network of pseudonymous accounts across half a dozen now-defunct platforms, evidence, prosecutors argued, of a pattern spanning decades rather than a single isolated crime. Investigators in Nevada and Washington reopened their respective cold cases in full, working alongside Chen's team to determine whether the same careful, patient method Voss had used on Maddie Turner had claimed other victims whose families had spent years believing, wrongly, that their children had simply run away. The final 6 months of the investigation focused on a single, desperate question the entire Turner family had been forced to hold in their minds for 19 years without ever letting themselves fully ask it out loud: whether there was still, after everything, any chance she might be found alive. The break came not from Voss, who never fully confessed to Maddie's ultimate fate, but from the same digital forensics work that had cracked the case open in the first place. Financial records tied to a decades-old shell account linked to Voss showed a series of small, recurring payments made throughout the mid-2000s to a private residential facility in rural Montana. Payments that, on the surface, resembled the kind of arrangement a family might make for a relative requiring long-term, discreet psychiatric or medical care. Investigators, working from a warrant obtained within days, discovered the facility had, for over 15 years, housed a woman registered under the name Rebecca Voss, listed in the facility's own incomplete records as Gerald Voss's estranged daughter, suffering, according to intake paperwork, investigators would later determine was entirely fabricated from a rare dissociative condition that made her unable to safely live independently. A DNA sample, obtained through the facility with full legal authorization and compared against a reference sample voluntarily provided by Diane and Robert Turner, confirmed what investigators had allowed themselves, cautiously, to hope for through the final agonizing weeks of the case. The facility itself, a modest, licensed residential care home in a remote stretch of rural Montana, had operated for over 2 decades under an administrator who had since retired, replaced by newer staff who had simply inherited Rebecca Voss as a long-term resident along with her paperwork, never having any reason to question a file that had, on the surface, always looked entirely legitimate. Nurses who had cared for her over the years described a quiet, careful woman who followed the facility's routines without complaint, who read constantly, who kept almost entirely to herself except for a small handful of staff members she'd grown to trust over many years. Trust, investigators would come to understand, that had been built on the same patient, careful manipulation that had first drawn her into Voss's orbit as a teenager, simply extended and refined over 2 more decades. One nurse, who had worked at the facility for nearly 12 years, recalled a conversation from several years earlier in which Rebecca had said, quietly, almost in passing, that she sometimes had dreams about a town with a park and a footbridge, dreams she'd been told, gently but firmly, by facility staff following psychiatric guidance that had itself been shaped by Voss's original fabricated diagnosis, were simply symptoms of her condition, not memories worth examining. The nurse, when told the truth years later, said she had not slept properly for a week afterward, replaying that conversation in her mind and wondering how many other small, dismissed signals had passed through that facility over 15 years unexamined. The woman known to the facility for over 15 years as Rebecca Voss was Madison Turner. She had been alive the entire time, kept for nearly 2 decades under a fabricated psychiatric diagnosis in a facility whose staff, investigators would come to believe, had never fully understood the truth of the situation they had unknowingly participated in, isolated so completely and for so long that she had, according to the trauma specialists who began working with her immediately after her identification, come to genuinely doubt, after so many years of being told otherwise, whether the childhood she remembered had ever truly belonged to her at all. Sometimes the truth doesn't disappear. It simply waits. Sometimes behind a locked facility door 2 states away, for someone willing to keep looking long enough to find it. The reunion took place in a private room at the Montana facility, arranged carefully by a trauma-informed care team that had spent days preparing both Maddie and her family for a moment 19 years in the making, aware that nothing about this reunion could be treated as simple or straightforwardly joyful. Diane Turner, 62 now, walked into that room and saw, for the first time in 19 years, a face that was both entirely her daughter's and entirely a stranger's. 35 years old now, where the photograph on the missing persons flyer had frozen her forever at 16. Maddie did not run to her mother the way reunions are shown in movies. She sat very still, her hands folded carefully in her lap, and studied Diane's face for a long moment before saying, quietly, the first words her mother had heard from her in 19 years. "You look older than I remember." It was, Diane would later say, somehow exactly the right thing for her daughter to say, an ordinary observation offered in the middle of an entirely extraordinary moment, a small thread of the sharp, funny 16-year-old girl who had once organized a 9-clue scavenger hunt, still visible somewhere underneath everything 19 years of captivity had tried to erase. Robert Turner, standing in the doorway, unable at first to make himself cross the threshold, later described the moment his daughter looked directly at him and said his name, just his name, nothing more, as the single most overwhelming instant of his life, more overwhelming even than her birth had been, because it arrived after 2 full decades of not knowing whether he would ever hear it again. Jake Turner brought his own daughter, 7-year-old Madison, to a second, more gradual visit 2 weeks later, uncertain until the very last moment whether it was the right decision, watching with his heart in his throat as his sister knelt slowly to meet the gaze of a little girl who had been named for her, who had grown up hearing stories about an aunt she'd been told, gently, might never come home. Maddie herself, in the weeks following her identification, described to her trauma team a fractured, disorienting process of beginning to separate what she now understood to be true from what she had been told, gently and repeatedly, for nearly 2 decades, was true instead. She had been given, over the years, a constructed history of her own life. False memories of a childhood illness, a fabricated account of a mother who had died when Rebecca was young, an entire narrative designed, investigators believed, to make the isolation feel less like captivity and more like simply the shape her life had always taken. Undoing that narrative, one specialist explained in general terms, was not as simple as presenting her with the truth. It required her, slowly and on her own timeline, to trust her own buried memories over a version of reality she had been conditioned for years to accept without question. She recognized her mother's voice. She told her therapist during one of their early sessions before she consciously recognized her face. A small, involuntary flicker of memory that arrived, she said, like a word on the tip of your tongue that you can't quite catch, present and unmistakable and just out of reach all at once. It was, the trauma team noted, one of the earliest and most encouraging signs that somewhere beneath 19 years of engineered forgetting, the girl who had once organized a 9-clue scavenger hunt for her best friend had never fully disappeared. Priya Anand, now a family therapist herself, drove 12 hours straight to Montana the day she got the call and sat with Maddie for 3 hours that first visit, without either of them managing more than a handful of words, simply holding hands the way they had as children, relearning, slowly, what it meant to be present with each other after 19 years neither of them had chosen. Gerald Voss was charged with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and a lengthening list of related offenses across 3 states, alongside renewed charges connected to the Nevada and Washington cases, investigators believe, though have not yet conclusively proven, may be linked to the same decades-long pattern. He has entered no plea beyond a blanket denial through counsel and is currently awaiting trial. Legal experts following the case have noted that the sheer span of time involved, 19 years between the crime and the arrest, creates unusual complications for prosecutors, from statute of limitations questions on secondary charges to the challenge of building a case around evidence that spans 2 decades of shifting technology and record-keeping standards. The lead prosecutor assigned to the case has said publicly only that her office is confident in the strength of the physical and financial evidence recovered. Evidence that does not depend on Voss's cooperation to establish the timeline investigators believe occurred. The staff at the Montana facility, none of whom investigators believe knowingly participated in the deception, are cooperating fully with a state licensing review examining how a fabricated diagnosis and a falsified family relationship went unquestioned for 15 years. A review the Turner family has said, through their attorney, they hope leads to real, lasting changes rather than simply another closed file. Maddie Turner, she has said, in the only public statement she has authorized so far, that she is not yet ready to decide whether she wants to be called Maddie or Rebecca or something else entirely, that the question of her own name feels, after 19 years, like the first real choice she has been allowed to make in a very long time. Continues intensive trauma therapy alongside a slow, careful reintegration into a family and a world that moved on, in her absence, in ways both large and achingly small. She has asked her family not to share further details of her recovery publicly, a request they have honored completely, choosing instead to let the one fact that matters most speak for itself, that after 19 years, a girl the world had quietly given up on walked, on her own 2 feet, back into the arms of the people who never stopped waiting for her. The trauma team working with Maddie has described her recovery, in the limited terms the family has authorized for public understanding, as a process without any clear map to follow. 19 years of isolation, compounded by the specific cruelty of having been told, repeatedly and for so long, that her own memories of a family and a childhood were symptoms of an illness rather than the truth of who she actually was. Rebuilding trust in her own mind, one specialist noted in a general statement about cases of this kind, is often harder than rebuilding trust in the people around her, because the most serious damage occurs in the relationship a person has with their own memory. Diane Turner has spoken, in careful and limited terms, about learning to let her daughter set the pace of every part of this reunion. Resisting the urge to fill 19 years of missed conversation in a single afternoon, learning to sit in comfortable silence rather than push for the kind of instant closeness she had imagined in her most hopeful moments over 2 decades that a reunion might bring. "I got her back," she said. "I didn't get back the 16-year-old who left for track practice that Friday. I'm still meeting the person she became instead. I think I always will be." Ashland Falls held no press conference, no town-wide celebration. Diane Turner said only, when asked, that some homecomings are too large and too complicated for a town square, that this one belonged, for now, only to the people in that room in Montana who had waited 19 years to be in it. Sometimes the truth doesn't disappear. It simply waits for someone willing to keep looking, however long that looking takes. Thank you for watching. If this case fascinated you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more incredible crime and mystery stories. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and never stop asking questions.